in our second lecture on the executive branch, again focusing on the president in this particular examination. We're going to start by looking at the running of the government at the top levels of the bureaucracy. And one of the things we need to understand is how the bureaucracy has changed since the United States Constitution established our current system. So in the earliest years of the Republic, the bureaucracy was tiny, especially the part of it that interacted directly with the president. The president essentially had 4 advisors. There was the Department of State, which had 9 employees, the Department of War, which later becomes the Department of Defense, and now, depending on who you ask, is again the Department of War, had only 3. And the Treasury was larger. It's not surprising. Remember, one of the things the Constitution was supposed to do was improve the ability of the federal government to obtain revenue, to pay for the government's expenses. Then there was an Attorney General, and there is still an Attorney General. This person now heads the Justice Department. As of 1862, and these years are to some extent random, based on where I can do things such as find nice graphic depictions of the size of the bureaucracy, it's still small. These figures represent the cabinet posts around the president, and there are only 7 of them. And if you were able to look really, really closely or have excellent eyesight, one of these is the Department of War, one is the Department of the Navy. These both become later not cabinet level posts in their own right, but part of the Department of Defense. And one of these departments is cabinet level at this point, is the U.S. Mail. So still a very small federal bureaucracy. Today, of course, it is much larger. There are now, as we will see, 15 cabinet level departments. These are the people who constitute the official advisors to the president and will have regular meetings with the president. Some of these have gotten a lot of television coverage recently. Again, originally only 4 positions. There's 3 departments and 1 advisor: State, War, Treasury, and the Attorney General serving as the advisor. And today there are 15 of these positions. And as we talk about them, we need to understand kind of where they come from. Presidents can create positions within the executive branch, but the cabinet level departments are creatures of Congress, at least to the extent they were created legislatively by Congress. And they cannot be abolished except by act of Congress. And this is something that has, at least early in Trump's second administration, got a fair bit of attention. President and others in his administration expressed a desire to abolish the Department of Education, which would require, to officially abolish it, an act of Congress. In this case, the executive found some workarounds, and for other federal agencies as well, that the new administration wanted to do away with, and that is to order the people there not to do work, to withhold funding appropriated for different purposes for those departments. So understand that this has become an area, and not for the first time, has become a real area of tension between the executive and legislative branches. As we talk about the cabinet level departments, what you need to understand is that these are the entities that are responsible for the day-to-day operations of the federal government. The federal government is massive, the bureaucracy is massive, the number of personnel, again, massive, and one person is not going to be able to run all of that. So you have these 15 cabinet level departments, and there are others at lower levels, and these are what keep the government functioning on a day-to-day basis and make a lot of its decisions. And so these cabinet level officials really do have important jobs. They're responsible for the department itself, but also kind of the agencies that it oversees. For example, in the news a lot in 2025 and into 2026, you have the Department of Homeland Security, and within that you also have the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. You have the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. So cabinet officials are responsible for their department proper, but also agencies overseen by their department. They're also responsible for giving advice to the president on issues that are specific to their department's area of jurisdiction and area of expertise. And, of course, as we saw, established in practical terms much more by the precedent of George Washington than what is in the Constitution. The cabinet officials take orders from the president and implement them through their departments. The Constitution says that the cabinet officials have to report to the president, but Washington made it clear through the precedents he set early on that these departments would act by his instructions and not act in ways that he had not instructed them to behave. And so they are very much answerable to the president for what they have done, but also in terms of taking orders for what they're going to do. And this is where we see one of the uses of executive orders that often doesn't get as much attention. The president signs executive orders to inform his departments of the policy objectives he has and the actions he wants them to undertake. And so these act as orders to the departments themselves, but also all of the bureaucracies that they oversee. This kind of gives us a visual and breakdown of the 15-level cabinet departments. Of course, you already understand from what we've already said, they have not always been there. Some have been there the whole time. State, Treasury have been there the whole time. They're the only two that have been consistent. The Department of War, yes, but of course changing to become the Department of Defense. And as you work down through here, you can also see that the most recent was created after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, and that is the Department of Homeland Security. Also, we mentioned that there had been a Department of the Postal Service. That is no longer a cabinet-level post. The U.S. Postal Service still exists as an independent executive agency, but we'll get to that. One of the other parts of the president's system for managing his administration and the government is White House offices. And these are trickier things to talk about. For one, because the system hasn't been around really for all that long. Until Franklin Roosevelt, we did not have this modern system. The White House offices, in terms of people who answered to the president, very small. Jefferson had 2 staff to serve him. There was roughly a dozen up until the early 1900s. And there are reports that Woodrow Wilson was still typing much of his own correspondence. Of course, that would have been between March 1913 and March 1921. Now there are about 600 staff in the White House offices. We are not going to talk about all of them. And one of the issues, again, as I said, some of these parts are permanent, but others kind of come and go with different presidencies. For example, Donald Trump brings in, and it was not clear where this necessarily fit between White House offices and cabinet departments, but things like DOGE. Biden had his own special White House office for innovation. So some of these things change, but some are more permanent, and we can talk about those more fruitfully. The first person we need to talk about is the Chief of Staff. This is kind of the person that works for the president to make sure that the rest of the White House office staff are doing what he needs to do, as they take care of a lot of the details and things that would otherwise make it difficult for the president to go through their day. It's a powerful position, but we'll kind of talk about it. We don't often see that person in the limelight. There's also the press secretary. This person, of course, we do see in the limelight. They are the person who interacts on behalf of the administration with the press at routine press briefings. And a lot of times these get a lot of attention. In my own YouTube feed, they show up a ton in the shorts that YouTube is trying to push to me. As a press secretary, very much in the limelight. They act kind of as the spokesperson for the president. The NSA, now this is not the National Security Agency. Be careful, this is the National Security Advisor. This person is not in charge of the National Security Council. That is one of the important offices, but they act as you might guess, the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, and they do, of course, also attend meetings of the National Security Council. There are also congressional liaisons. These are the people, we've talked about the president as the chief legislator, the person who does so much to set the legislative agenda. They are there to interact with members of Congress and their staff to kind of shape that agenda and ensure that the president's interests are being represented. Other than the press secretary, again, these people are mostly out of sight. Susie Wiles, I mean, honestly, I would have forgotten who the chief of staff is if I had ever really entirely been cognizant of who it was, except for the fact that she gave an interview with a news magazine where she talked about a lot of things that proved not to be very flattering of Trump administration officials. And so she got a lot of attention for that, and all of a sudden she is in the limelight, and then guess what? Very quickly after that, she is back out. She's still in her job, but we don't hear about her. Stephen Miller is, I believe, he's the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, I believe is his official title. This kind of person also usually would not be that much in the news, but Stephen Miller is seen as the architect for a lot of things like the surge of ICE enforcement. And so Stephen Miller gets a lot more attention than would be common. And so we can think of these as exceptions to the rule. Pardon me. What we're going to talk about now is the executive office of the president. And do notice that the top of this organizational chart is, of course, the executive office of the president. Within that is the White House office. So if we take a step back, understand that we've already talked about the White House offices. So they are kind of part and parcel to this. But the executive office of the president is, of course, much bigger with these different components. And this is kind of just a stylized organizational chart. It's not that there's necessarily a hierarchy as we move down this. It is also not a complete example. The president has a great deal of power to shape things that are and are not part of the executive office. So let's kind of understand what it is in general. So for one thing, it's a group of bodies that are either there to give the president advice in making policies, or they are there to administer or carry out policies. And as I said, this chart we have is kind of stylized. There's a lot of variation, or can be a lot of variation from one administration to the next. Some bits of it that are created by Congress are more permanent. They're not something that presidents can just abolish on their own. We'll kind of see some of that as we go. So as we think about these, whether they are advisory or administrative, they are there to help the president oversee the policy of the executive branch. We will focus on some key components. all of these are created by Congress. That asterisk at the end will come into play. So National Security Council, created in 1947. As you might have guessed from the name of this helps the president coordinate their security policy. National security involves intelligence agencies, foreign and domestic agencies, different elements of the armed forces, so Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Navy, Marines. So that's a lot of security policy things to coordinate. Shouldn't leave the Coast Guard out of that. The key person to know here, of course, besides the President of the United States, is the National Security Advisor, who we already met as part of the key White House personnel. Remember, they're not in charge of the NSA or the NSC. All right, sorry. Let's be clear about that. The National Security Advisor is not the head of the National Security Council, but they do participate in its proceedings with the President of the United States. The Council of Economic Advisors, created by Congress, again, all of these in 1946. One of the reasons we talk about it, not only is it a permanent part of the executive office of the president and created by Congress, but its chair requires confirmation by the Senate. And this makes it different from the White House offices. The White House offices, the people that work there are wholly up to the discretion of the President of the United States. When we get to the EOP, the Executive Office of the President, that's not always the case. In this case, the chair requires Senate confirmation. The Office of Management and Budget. This is where our asterisk comes in. Notice it has two creation dates, in 1921 and 1970. It was created as the Bureau of Budget by Congress in 1921. Nixon overhauled it and made it into what it is today, the Office of Management and Budget, in 1970. This office, as you might have guessed, has much to do with the budget. It prepares the president's budget, taking in all the requests from the various different parts of the executive branch. It also studies the budget impacts of various proposed policies. Understand, is this going to cut into revenue? Is this going to bring in new revenue? Is this going to cost a lot of money to implement? Is it going to lead to increased need for borrowing? All of those kinds of things the OMB deals with. Its top officials require confirmation. And there's more than one, and you do not need to worry about the specifics. This office has become so important and so large that Congress feared that it was not going to be able to keep up with the information that the executive branch had in terms of budget and policy. And so the Congress created the CBO. We've met the CBO before. It's the Congressional Budget Office. Congress created it as a counterweight to the CBO lets Congress have their own information. So especially when you have what we call divided government, where one party controls Congress, the other party controls the president, the CBO can sometimes provide Congress with numbers, not in a partisan way. The CBO is itself nonpartisan. You've heard me before describe them as those lovable nerds, but sometimes through the information they are able to provide, Congress is able to have information to counter budget projections or economic projections of certain policies proposed by the executive branch. So it is important not just as a counterpart, but as a counterweight to the Office of Management and Budget. And then, of course, there is, finally, the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, created in 1962. The representative and deputy directors within this part, so the representative is called the U.S. Trade Representative. So it is an individual, but it is also a body within the EOP. So the representative and deputy directors of this office require confirmation by the Senate. As you might have guessed, this is all about trade. The USTR advises the president about trade policies, developments in international trade. It also formulates U.S. trade policy, advocates for U.S. trade policy both domestically and abroad, and that leads into the next job for the USTR, negotiates with foreign states to work out things like trade deals, different agreements on, say, tariffs, quotas, market access, protection of intellectual property rights, all kinds of things are negotiated by the USTR. It is often a very important position. Not always as high profile as the current USTR, Jamison Greer, has been, but often very important. And then there are the independent agencies. Now, I know initially when you guys first saw these were the strange animals where you weren't sure where they went. Did they belong to Congress? Did they belong to the executive branch? What are they? Well, they are kind of their own things. And there are a lot of them. There are over 100 that fit into this category. Some of them are independent agencies. We will also meet them later as commissions and such. And some of them have been very powerful historically. The future of a lot of the independent agencies is uncertain, especially to the extent to which they are independent. And here I mean independent of the President of the United States, right? The chief executive. This is something that is very much unsettled at this point, so we'll have to see how that shakes out. Let's meet some of these. The Federal Reserve System, known as the Fed. This is one of those that has historically been very powerful, continues to be very powerful for now, although it's caught up in a lot of political conflict at the moment. The Securities and Exchange Commission. I guess I should tell you a little bit about what these do. So the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. It's supposed to minimize inflation and maximize employment. And that dual mandate, those two objectives are often very much in tension. Fed always has a tough job to do. Often what they do is going to be very unpopular with somebody, hence them being caught up in a lot of conflict right now. Securities and Exchange Commission, they deal with, most notably, you will see the SEC involved in things like stock markets, commodities markets, to make sure that companies are playing by the rules, that there's not insider trading, unless you're a member of Congress. And for now, if you're a member of Congress, you can inside trade to your heart's content. That's a different matter. At NASA, if you had not heard of the previous two, I'm sure you have heard of NASA. They're not quite the big deal they were when I was a kid, because when I was a kid, they were the only game in town for U.S. Space programs. Now we have, of course, a variety of private players in that space as well, like SpaceX, for example, which is not a part of the government. The Federal Communications Commission, these are responsible for determining which radio stations, which TV stations are able to broadcast on which bands, what counts as appropriate or inappropriate content for use of those airwaves, those kinds of things. U.S. Postal Service, also in here as an independent agency. We will see that it is something else too when we talk about bureaucracy. Federal Election Commission, remember, states carry out elections, but the FEC deals with a lot of things in terms of how campaigns can be run, how they can be financed. The FTC, you're most likely to see these in the news when there's talk of a merger between two companies. The FTC decides whether that creates something that is a monopoly or too close to a monopoly, and they can block mergers based on those decisions. And the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, often historically a powerful independent agency with a lot of ability to set rules on various things like even emissions of carbon dioxide in some cases. We're now going to shift gears in kind of a major way. So we've met the executive branch again for now, focusing with the parts closest to the president. Before we leave this to go look at the bureaucracy, we're going to look at presidential power over time.